They took that one step beyond.
All right, class, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to look a little bit at 17th century in American or English literature here. Metaphysical poetry is basically sort of the big theme when you look at the three poets this particular week. So we'll go ahead and get started with a little bit of the lecture. If anybody joins and has any burning questions about anything as far as, sort of doing like a tutoring session, we can kind of do that toward the end. I want to sort of get through some of this information first. So if you have any questions about a particular assignment or the assignment this week, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And if you received the email yesterday, I talked a little bit about adding, which I did. I added an option B to your actual poetry essay that's going to be due not this Sunday, but the next Sunday. We'll talk a little bit more about that here momentarily. So a little bit of historical background for Britain, 1625 through 1702. We had basically three religious groups: the Church of England, basically the Anglican Protestants, the official state church as established by Henry VIII during his Reformation. This is basically a hierarchical structure governed by archbishops and bishops, a living symbol of England's independence from Rome. Then you had the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholics, a sizable minority, did not accept the Reformation and remained Catholic. Then we had the third group, which are the Protestants, Presbyterians, and the Dissenters. They were pretty much nonconformists, started to form during the reign of Elizabeth I, believed that the Reformation had not been radical enough, elected their ministers, and criticized as undemocratic the hierarchical structure of other churches, had very strict moral principles, and the way to salvation lie in a life of hard work and avoidance of all forms of frivolous entertainment. So some of y'all probably learned about Puritans, especially the American Puritans, maybe in an American literature course. They did a lot of poetry. Some of them did. Some of them wrote a lot of prose writings. You probably learned a lot about them in history as well. Politics in 17th century England. You had the autocratic monarchs, the Tudors. We had Charles I, 1625 through 1649. At 1629, dissolved the parliament, ruled for 11 years without one. 1640, had to reopen the parliament to ask for taxes. The parliament refused. 1642, the parliament demanded the control of the army. Charles' refusal meant civil war. So they had an English civil war, really starting around the early 1640s. Puritan army under the command of Oliver Cromwell versus the King's Royalist forces. There was a Puritan victory. Charles was executed on June 30th of 1649. Cromwell and his followers founded a republic, the Commonwealth. It collapsed in 1660 after the death of Cromwell. Monarchy restored with the Restoration with Charles II. Puritan and Restoration poetry. So you get a little bit of this with John Milton when you look at his particular sonnet. And you get a little bit with Andrew Marvell, and some with John Donne. But we'll talk a little bit more about why they also sort of fit into the category of metaphysical poetry as well. So for a period after the Renaissance, poetry divided into two trends: Cavalier poets and the metaphysical poets. Cavalier poets defended the monarchy against the Puritans during the reign of Charles I. These include Robert Herrick, Thomas Crewell, Robert Lovelace, and Sir John Suckling. Ideal, some of the themes that they like to use not only in their real life, but also into their particular works of art, poetry, and that type of deal would be ideal gentleman, a lover, a soldier, a wit, a musician, a poet, obviously. They were lighthearted approach. They took a lighthearted approach to life. Poetry for births, marriages, and great parties. Some poems embodied the spirit of the upper class before the Puritan Commonwealth. So here's a particular example of a Cavalier poet, Sir John Suckling, basically, why so pale and wan, found lover. Out upon it I have loved 3 whole days together, and am like to love 3 more, if it proved good weather. We don't really read too many in this particular, at least this semester. I didn't really include too many Cavalier poets. Perhaps I should have, just to show the sort of the difference between the two. But there was just, I mean, so much to choose from as it relates to these two different types of poetry. The metaphysical to me seems to be a little bit more interesting. They get a little bit more deeper with their thought, and that's sort of the reason why I went with metaphysical poetry. The next time I teach this class, I may include some of the Cavalier poets, or just focus on Cavalier poetry a little bit more. To Electra. This is from Robert Herrick. I dare not ask a kiss, I dare not beg a smile, least having that or this, I might grow proud the while. No, no, the utmost share of my desires shall be only to kiss the air that lately kissed thee. So you get this sort of imagery that he wishes to kiss the same air as his particular lover because, well, as humans, both male and female in this case, his lover, both share the same air. And he says if he can't necessarily kiss her in the flesh, lips touching lips, that he can at least kiss the air as she previous did. Metaphysical poetry, which is sort of, again, the theme of week 8 here with our particular poets. We had George Herbert, Richard Croshaw, and Henry Vaughan. They followed in the tradition of John Donne, 1572 to 1631. Misleading term, metaphysical, used by literary critic Samuel Johnson, the 18th century. Poetry did not deal with philosophical speculation, but with the themes of religion and love. We see that Sir Johnson, or Samuel Johnson here, used the word metaphysical to criticize what he considered to be the poet's desire to be original at any cost. 18th and 19th century, the metaphysical poets were fairly unpopular, and a lot of it is because of the criticism of one of the lead critics of the day, which was Samuel Johnson. Beginning of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot helped generate new appreciation for Donne as follows. So we're, probably about the 1900s or so, metaphysical poetry sort of became back into light due to the writer, the poet, and critic T.S. Eliot. Eliot and Johnson had two different opinions of what metaphysical poetry and the poets, what their task and aim really was. So that's why we sort of had this rebirth in the at the beginning of the 20th century of metaphysical poets and their poetry. Some things to kind of keep in mind when you're reading the 3 poets this week. Some of the features that go with metaphysical poetry. They like to use what they call conceits, which is sort of like a extended metaphor to some degree. If you looked at some of your terms in your e-text, it talks a little bit more about metaphors, and it should talk a little bit more about extended metaphors. But a conceit is basically a comparison between objects which at first glance seem to have nothing in common. You also have the argumentative quality of the love poems, in which the poet tries to persuade his lover to share his point of view. Probably see a little bit of that with Donne. You have a dramatic quality of the language, which often seems to be one side of a dialogue between the poet and his lover, or God, or himself. You may see some of that with Milton and Marvell. They also have a wide range of subjects from which the poet draws his imagery. So they're really heavy with sciences, They like to also use travel, medicine, philosophy versus Elizabethan poetry, which, when we looked at Spenser, um, Sidney, and Shakespeare last week, they like to use a lot of what is called stock imagery of the period, which is basically, birds. We see that with the nightingale, flowers, sun, moon, and stars. And of course, oceans, beaches, and that type of stuff. Metaphysical poets and within the poetry, they like to use a good bit of wit. In the 17th century, this meant the ability to relate dissimilar ideas, implied intellectual genius, use of paradoxes, puns, and conceits. So one of the poets that we're going to be looking at in a particular poem is from John Donne. Here, Donne is basically, he was born 1572 and he died 1631. Born in London to a prominent Roman Catholic family, converted to Anglicanism during the 1590s. At the age of 11, he entered the University of Oxford, then Cambridge, but he didn't graduate with any degree. 1592, he began the study of law at Lincoln's Inn, London. Legal or diplomatic career was sort of in his path at that point. 1592, he appointed private secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton, keeper of the Great Seal. 1601, he secretly married Egerton's niece, Anne More. Dismissed from his position, briefly imprisonment. Made a merger living as a lawyer. He had a collection of poetry called Divine Poems, 1607. 1615, he became a priest of the Anglican Church, appointed by royal chaplain. 1621, named dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, attended eminence as a preacher, delivered the most brilliant and eloquent sermons of his time. So he's a really good speaker as it relates to things of religion and that type deal. A lot of people like to go to some of his sermons, listen to him speak, preach. Donne also had a very wide range of secular and religious subjects, cynical verse about inconsistency, poems about true love, Neoplatonic lyrics on the mystical union of lovers, soul, and bodies. And he also, excuse me, and he also wrote brilliant satires and hymns depicting his own spiritual struggles. Characteristics of Donne's poetry typify the work of the metaphysical poet. He had dazzling wordplay, often explicitly sexual sometimes, paradox, subtle argumentation, surprising contrast, intricate psychological analysis, and striking imagery selected from non-traditional areas like law, philosophy, and mathematics. One of his prose works is the Summons, which is imaginative explanations of biblical passages, intense exploration of the themes of divine lover and of the decay and restoration of the body. He also wrote in 1624 devotions upon emergent occasions. So the sermons here, early in the 1600s. And here you can kind of see a list of his poetry. He did, 1593, he had satires. 1601, he had songs and sonnets. Divine Poems in 1607. Anatomy of the World, 1611. And Autonomy of the World. The second anniversary of the Progress of the Soul, 1611. And Autonomy of the World, I guess, again in 1612, maybe a revision of that. Devotions upon emergent occasions, 1624, and Wisdom Crying Out to Sinners in 1639. He also wrote several essays, or a collection of several essays, including 1623, three sermons upon special occasions, the first sermon preached to King Charles, 1625, and Essays in Divinity, 1651. So this is sort of the poem that we are reading for this week. I'm not going to sit here and read it word for word, but if you click on the link, it will take you to that particular poem. I also provide notes that sort of go with that poem as well. That's sort of written in Russian, so we're not going to worry about that. Poetic Devices, ballad-like. Some of the poetry that we read this week are, going to be ballad-like. We dealt with some ballads. We remember too Rosamunde from Chaucer. His was sort of ballad-like. The poem from Queen Elizabeth was sort of ballad-like as well, where we have 4-line stanzas help create the gentle, slowly moving feel of the poem. The rhyme scheme is generally consistent and predictable. Emotion confined, right, to the ordinary lovers who cannot stand parting. And conceits used, we see with Donne and wife, celestial bodies, the points of compass, the wedding ring, the path of a planet, the symbol of gold, out the mine, right? The path traced out by a compass, emotions of the common people, earthquakes, and tempests, which is basically another name for storms. If you remember some of the plays and stuff of Shakespeare, because he uses a lot of the Tempest as one of his plays as well. We see here imagery and some references to Donne's learning, the circle, marriage ring, obviously, path of the planets, trepidations of the spheres, Mine's symbols of gold was a circle with a point in the center, path described by a compass. We also have a very broad range of knowledge display. Planetary, trepidation, earthquakes, the love of sublunary lovers, properties of gold, malleable, the most precious of all the metals, the least reactive to all metals, the most noble metal, the most difficult to destroy, and then compass imagery and use. This is really going on his 1624 work, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. We don't read it, but it deals with a lot of religious themes. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here since we don't necessarily read this particular work. So it's something that you can kind of look at here and just kind of be mindful of. He was a highly religious poet as well. Here's another one of his poems, To His Mistress Going to Bed, that we don't read, but it sort of goes on the same line as it relates to some of the same themes that we read in the poem for this particular week by him anyway. Here's another, Death Be Not Proud, is one of his most famous, one of his more famous pieces. Again, we don't necessarily read this particular piece, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if you want to read a little bit more on Donne or read a little bit more of his work, you can always Google some of this stuff to get some criticism and read a little bit more about Donne and his poetry. Milton. We do look at one of Milton's sonnets. John Milton was 1608 to 1674, born in London on December 9th, 1608, into a middle-class family. Prepared to enter the clergy after university, Christ College, Cambridge, abandoned plans to join the priesthood. Course of independent study to prepare for a career as a poet, classical, modern works of religion, science, philosophy, history, politics, and literature. He was very proficient in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, Italian, and familiar with Old English and Dutch. So he was a very smart individual, especially at a time where he could learn a lot of these um, languages without, really on his own. I mean, he didn't have much of a teacher there. He didn't have like a Duolingo or a Google Translator to help him be able to translate and read. He had to do this on his own. May 1638 began a 13-month tour of France and Italy, met many important intellectuals and influential people, including the astronomer Galileo. So that's an interesting um, fact that John Milton actually met Galileo. During the English Civil War, he championed the cause of the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell. He wrote a series of pamphlets advocating radical political topics, morality of divorce, the freedom of the press, populism, and sanctioned regicide. Served as secretary for foreign languages in Cromwell's government, obviously, since he knew a lot of them, comprising official statements defending the Commonwealth. He began, though, in 1651. He went completely blind, but he steadily started to lose his eyesight. And a lot folks may not know that usually his most popular or epic piece is Paradise Lost. And he was actually going blind at that point when he was trying to write those books of Paradise Lost. So he had his daughters sort of become his eyes, and they would sort of, write. He would speak, obviously, and they would write down what he was speaking. They sort of became his eyes when it came to writing once he started to go blind. After the restoration of Charles II to the throne in 1660, he was arrested as a defender of the Commonwealth, fined, but he was soon released. From that part, he pretty much lived the rest of his life in seclusion in the country. He completed the blank verse epic poem in 1667 of Paradise Lost. There's a sequel, Paradise Regained, 1671. And then he had a tragedy, Samson, there at 1671. Oversaw the printing of a second edition of Paradise Lost in 1674, including an explanation of why the poem rhymes not, clarifying his use of blank verse. And you start to see a lot of blank verse earlier. You start to see that with a good bit of Shakespeare's plays. He uses a lot of the blank verse in some of his plays as well. Milton actually died on November 8th of 1674 in Buckinghamshire, England. And this is sort of a selective bibliography of some of his works. He had poetry, he had Lyticus, 1638, poems, 1645. We see Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson, all in that period, the late 1660s and early 1670s. Again, we don't really get into his big epic here, Paradise Lost, but this is some of the stuff that it deals with. It chronicles Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from Eden. Masterpiece and one of the greatest epic poems in world literature. Debates regarding its theological themes, political commentary, and its depiction of the fallen angel Satan, who is often viewed, uncharacteristically to some at this time as the protagonist of the work. In choosing between Latin and English for the language of the poem, Milton compromised by inventing a new dialect of poetry, one that is removed from the language of natural speech. How could this rebel Puritan not have a degree of sympathy for the arch rebel Satan, is one particular question. And then, how could a scholar such as Milton believe that the tree of knowledge should be forbidden to mankind? Really two big questions that are often asked while reading Paradise Lost. And here's sort of the first part of book one, right? Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hell, horrors, hell, infernal world, thou profoundest hell, received thy newest possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven, which that is kind of true. Sometimes we create our own problems, and then we dwell on them in our own mind and don't realize that, we basically have it a lot easier than most folks around us. And we just don't realize it because we dwell too much on the negative and don't necessarily focus so much on what we do have going for us and the positive vibes that are around us. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater, here at least we shall be free. Thy almighty hell not built here from his envy will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worthy ambition. Through in hell, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So again, this is sort of that opening where he sort of takes Satan as his protagonist a little bit. It's a long and lengthy, often complicated work, especially knowing what Milton believed and who he sort of supported, because he basically supported the Puritans in a lot of this, as it relates, sort of contrast with what he's sort of doing in Paradise Lost here. All right. We don't really get to Marvell in this particular lecture, but when we look here, and again, this is our particular week 8. And as you can tell, some of the stuff from week 7 I moved, like the countdowns. If you notice, we have, roughly 19 days before we have the poetry exam. And I give you some information up here about that. So again, let's pull this up in case you didn't have a chance to read it last week, or just sort of as a brief review. Pull this over. So again, this basically, you're going to have a 10 objective multiple choice test on a particular poem. And I give you the poem way in advance. So you've had it since last week, maybe even a little earlier, but I know it was in last week's folder. This particular exam is going to be password sensitive. I will start emailing the password out. I'll probably put it with the test as well, like I did with the fiction exam. So you're going to need to use that particular password to be able to get into the actual test. The password will be different than the fiction exam password. So if you try to use the fiction exam password on this, if you still remember it, it won't work. So don't even waste your time with that. It's going to be due on Halloween, October 31st by 11:59 p.m. Again, no late exams. Obviously, once the exam is open, I'll probably open that up here a little earlier. And once you have the password, you can always take the exam earlier if you choose to. You don't have to wait to Halloween to do it, especially if you have plans or if you have kids that you want to try to do trick-or-treating. You don't have to wait to that Sunday to actually take the test. So basically what I have here, it says the poetry exam will test your knowledge on certain poetic concepts and terms that you should have learned by keeping up with the weekly readings and assignments during the last 5 weeks, which is basically weeks 6 through 10. So, all the notes and the key terms, right? The key poetic terms, metaphor, simile, iambic pentameter, sonnets, odes, when we start talking about the ode to autumn with Keats next week, the forms of poetry, some of the key vocabulary that you should have had a chance to, if not be familiar with in some of the weekly readings as it relates to the notes to some of the weekly readings, but the key poetic concepts and terms that you should have read or at least be mindful of in your e-text, because there's a whole list of vocabulary there that deals not only with fiction writing, but it also deals with the poetry that we've read basically by the time you take this test, it'll be the last 5 weeks. So once you hit begin, the timer is going to begin ticking down. So you're going to have 75 minutes to complete the 10 multiple choice poetry exam. The poem you will be tested on is below in a hyperlink. So click on the link to read the poem as many times as you need before taking the exam. So you want to click, right? The poem is right here. It's a Jonathan Swift poem, Description of the Morning. So I'm just going to highlight it, and you can copy the hyperlink, and I'm going to pull that up here in a minute so I can show you what it looks like. This is the poem. It's relatively short. It's what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, about 18, 20 lines. It's relatively short. You can read it multiple times. I suggest that you do. If you haven't, to go ahead and start reading it, maybe even printing this thing out and taking notes on it. If need be, you could start, looking up various criticism. Hopefully it's scholarly criticism on this particular poet, maybe online or through Galileo. Because, I'm not stupid. I know you're probably going to try to use notes for this particular exam. There's really just no way I can, test whether you study for this properly or not. Obviously I can, I guess, by the grade, but, I can't really gauge whether you use notes, whether you used each other, whatever the case may be. I would hope that you take the honor code seriously and that you don't just try to find various things, cliff notes and that type stuff, because they may or may not be out there on this particular poem, to use that as a crutch to try to get through the test, because that may or may not help you. Because some of the questions are basically formed in a way that you're going to have to sort of read it and do a little bit of thinking on your own. If you want to do a little bit of research, right? What is he really talking about? What is Swift getting at in here? That, that's fine, as long as it's sort of, written by an expert or scholarly in nature. Now, some of these sites like Spark Notes and Lick Charts and Cliff Notes, you kind of expect that they probably are written by some experts. Sometimes they only hit the high notes. They don't go into as deep as a test question would. So be mindful of that. So when we go back to the actual test information. So obviously you probably want to download and print out that particular poem so you can read it as many times as you need to read it before, agreeing to finally take the test. Because once you hit begin, you're going to have to take it, right? I can't really reset it or anything like that because it causes a lot more problems on my end if you actually accidentally begin and don't feel like you're not really ready for it. Because I have to go back in there and delete. And sometimes when you do that, sometimes you delete other people's tests and they're not going to be happy with that either. So you want to annotate your poem, right? Take notes. Maybe summarize what you think the poem means. Write notes on every line to give you something to study by. If you've been doing fairly well with the weekly readings, the poetry that you had to read from week 6 through 10, you looked at the e-text for those particular, what a metaphor is, what a simile is, what blank verse is, that type stuff, some of the key terms and concepts as it relates to poetry, then you shouldn't have too many problems, I hope, with this particular exam, because you're going to have some choices, right? Well, you can start narrowing down. Usually when you take multiple choice tests, you're going to have 4 choices. 2 of them are obviously going to be wrong, and then 2 of them are going to be close to being right, and of those 2, 1 is really going to be the correct answer. So if you can narrow down the 2 that are obviously wrong, you just increased your chances by 50% right there. The poem is not a difficult read, or it shouldn't, especially if you read it multiple times and you start taking your own notes and you start going out and possibly looking up your own sort of research to help support your notes. You might want to check YouTube to see if anybody's actually discussed this poem in a little bit more detail. That could be a helpful resource to use. And that could be a helpful resource to use with any of the poems that we talk about over these 5 weeks. I do give you some hints to sort of be mindful of. And if you can be mindful of these hints while you read the poem multiple times and take your own notes, and while you study for this, I'm sort of giving you the keys to the kingdom here, right? So hints to be mindful of while reading and studying for the exam. Be mindful of what the poem's title is and what the reader would expect to find or not find while reading this poem. So, titles of poems, titles of anything really, have some sort of a intrigue or interest. There has to be a reason why the poet chose that particular title, description of the morning. You also want to pay close attention to where the poem speaker lives or does not live. Does he live in the city? Does he live in the country? Does he live by the water? Does he live in outer space? I mean, you want to be mindful of the actual poet's environment, atmosphere, and surroundings. Know the meanings behind the words and diction, the language that Swift uses throughout the poem, as well as the duties of what some of the people may or may not do in the poem. So what I mean by that, just to sort of give you a hint, is if you look at here, we have, master. What does that mean? Betty, who is that? Mall, what is that? Small coal man, what do they do? Chimney sweeper, what is that? Turnkey, what is a turnkey? What does the speaker here mean by flock? So watchful bailiffs, what do they do? So some of these you could probably, as you read and get the context of the poem and take your own notes, you can start figuring out maybe what it means, what it is, what they do. Others you may have to do like a Google search, right? Highlight words and put it in Google and put, turnkey meaning, see what the meaning may be, and see if you can, drive by a definition to see if you can fit it into the context of the poem. You want to be familiar with various verse forms of poetry. And what I mean by that is this poem a sonnet? Well, what do we know about sonnets? Well, we read enough of them by this time. We know that most sonnets have 14 lines. Does this one have 14 lines? It looks like it has more, so it's probably not a sonnet. Think about the rhyme scheme, right? ABB, AB, AB. Does it have a rhyme scheme? Is it free verse, meaning there's not really any rhyme scheme to it? Is it a lyrical poem, which is more or less like, one that is lyrical in nature, one that you could easily sing? Um, is it a ode, which we're going to talk a little bit more about next week? So think about poetry forms, verse forms. And there's if you look at your e-text, they talk about various verse forms, but again, you can easily go to Google and type in various types of poetry verse forms to get an extensive list, and see, by your research and by your reading, to see which one maybe would fit the Swift poem here. You want to be familiar with various poetic terms detailed in your e-text. So I've been mentioning that a lot. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the key terms and the key definitions and that type of stuff as it relates to poetry. If you looked at some of the e-text pages that I've been providing since week 6, it will basically be on those pages. And you want to look at that stuff. You want to be mindful of the social range happening in the poem. Is this poem about peasants, poor people? Is it about the middle class? Is it about the upper class, the rich folks? Is it about a little bit about everybody? So you want to sort of be mindful of that. And maybe one way that you can start thinking in that direction is by looking up to see who Jonathan Swift is and sort of get his historical background. What kind of background did he grow up in? What kind of background did he live around as he became an adult? And you really want to pay close attention to the various metaphors that are happening throughout that particular poem. So if you keep these things mindful, if you've been keeping up with the reading in the e-text each week, if you have been doing fairly well with your analysis, like with the discussion post, with the first quiz, then the questions on this particular test are not there to throw you off. Is it a easy test? Well, it all depends on how much you study. If you study and take notes and done pretty much everything that you needed to do week in and week out, it shouldn't be that much of an issue for you, as long as you can manage the 75 minutes of your time. If you don't do those things, you haven't really been keeping up with the weekly readings and the e-text, you haven't been doing so well on quiz 2, the discussion post, you're not asking questions, you're not sending me drafts of essay 2, which we're going to talk about here momentarily, then this test will be challenging, especially if you only read the poem once and don't really take any time to annotate for your own knowledge and your own notes on the poem. So this is not one that you can just open up and read right then and do really well on. At least I don't think so. I think you have to at least read this multiple times and take notes. That's why I'm giving you the poem ahead of time, to give you, 3-4 weeks to really know the poem, to really read it multiple times, to really take the notes on it, to do a little bit of research if you need to do that, to even ask questions about it, right? I mean, I'm giving you time now that you can email me questions about the poem. Or if there's something sort of, stumping you or something of that nature, or if you just want to know if you're going in the right direction as it relates to you and your interpretation of it. I don't mind giving you hints or suggestions or comments that way. But what I can't do is take the exam for you. So by the time you hit begin, you're going to have to be really well read and well prepared to do it. All right. So switching out of here. The poetry essay is going to be due a little bit sooner, right? It's going to be due a week before on the 24th of October, which is a Sunday. Again, if you check the email, I updated by giving you a second option. So again, I'm going to pull this up. I know my time here is running short because I got another session I got to attend to my 11:01 online. But the guidelines are pretty much still the same. It still needs to, it's still going to be due on the 24th, Sunday by 11:59 again. There's going to be a Dropbox next week. The week 8 or the week 9 folder will probably open up a little earlier this week in case you want to write on some of the poems that we will be discussing and doing for next week. If you want to go ahead and get a head start on that reading, I will probably open up that folder as it gets closer to Friday. So you have two options. So it still needs to be 1,750 words or 7 pages plus a works cited. Please make sure that you are learning and know how to cite poetry correctly. A lot of y'all missed easy points to be earned in your discussion post because you just either you didn't look at the email that I sent out, back probably about week 5, week 6 when we really started this unit, because some of y'all just are not citing parenthetically or providing a works cited page for that matter as it relates to your textual evidence that you're taking, the quotations that you're taking from your poetry. And if you look, I went ahead and uploaded how to cite poetry in MLA. So now you can't say, well, I can't find the email, blah, 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 or whatever the case may be. Here is a website that will tell you and explain how you need to cite poetry. Please look at this. Make sure that when you're actually doing your essay, that you send me drafts. I think that was part of the issue with the fiction essay, that I didn't get a lot of drafts from everybody. I mean, I got drafts from the same folks, and the ones that sent me drafts and smart thinking drafts and started earlier on this usually got the best feedback. And ultimately, their grade was a lot better than most of those in the class who just never sent me a draft. And it was obviously you never sent anyone a draft, not even smart thinking, by some of the errors that you were making, because a lot of the stuff you could have caught just by reading your paper over and using spell check and grammar check, because a lot of the errors were grammatical in nature, some were in spelling, and then a lot of it was even trying to quote fiction correctly. So please use smart thinking. It's free. Please send me drafts to get feedback. That help is free too. That's sort of the reason why I gave everybody information about SA2 the first week that we started this unit, so that you can go ahead and have basically nearly 5 weeks, which if you look, 5 weeks, that's nearly about 35 days to get help. That's the same amount of time you had with the fiction essay to get help. Those that reached out and got help, like I said, did better on the actual essay. Those who didn't do so well for a variety of reasons. So here I give you still have the original option where you will have to read the 2 piano poems by D.H. Lawrence here. So again, I'm going to copy the link. I'm going to pull this up so I can show you where you can find it if you choose to do option A. Here it's going to give you a list. It's basically prompts from an AP exam, but you want to go down to page 5. If you look here, it's going to be 5 of or basically out of 61, and it's going to be on the 5th page. So these are the 2 poems. You have an earlier version of the piano, and then you have sort of a later version of the piano. So going back to the actual option A, it says read G.H. Lawrence's verse, Piano 1 and Piano 2, 2 poems with the same name carefully. So again, sort of like studying for that poetry exam, you want to probably download those 2 poems and start reading them as many times as you can, and take your own notes, annotate the text. If you need to go out again and look for criticism of a scholarly nature to sort of get a better handle of the 2 poems, you're free to do that. Don't feel like you need to turn this more into like a research paper. You don't. But if you do use secondary sources or criticisms, either from a database or a library or a Galileo or a web page or something, if you're quoting from somewhere or paraphrasing from some source, you need to make sure that you're documenting that correctly in text. And you want to, provide a works cited page for that. So if you don't use secondary sources, then there's going to be 2 poems, whether you choose option A or option B on your works cited page. Either for option A, it's going to be Piano 1 and Piano 2 by Lawrence, or for option B, which is what I added yesterday, it's going to be 2 of the poems that you chose between weeks 6 and 9. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So basically the prompt here is then write your essay in which you explain what characteristics of the second poem make it better than the first poem. Refer specifically to details of both poems by using textual evidence quotations. So again, that's why some of your some students, the discussion post 2 grades were down, was you just sort of gave me generalization and sweeping opinions or interpretation of those 2 questions that you answered, but you didn't quote from those 2 poems to support your particular ideas, and you never provided a works cited page, which was actually part of the instructions, is to quote textual evidence to support your thesis, to support your main ideas and claims and that type of stuff. So make sure that you're providing quotations from your poems to back up your points. Option B is you choose 2 poems from weeks 6 through 9, and you will write an explanation / compare and contrast, sort of what you're going to be doing with option A if you chose that, on your 2 poems. So we've read basically for these 3 weeks, right? Week 6, 7, 8, 9 will be 4 weeks. There's 3 poems in each one of those weeks. So by the time we get to week 9, you have read and looked at least 12 different poems. So you have enough to select from if you wanted to do 2. The guidelines remain the same for option B as they do for option A, which means you're still using Microsoft Word, you're still writing a 7-page paper, that type deal. However, you should select 2 poems we have read and discussed in the course, and you should select 2 poems that will provide enough similarities or differences between them to help you accomplish your task. Meaning, I wouldn't pick 2 poems that truly do not have any similarities or differences, because you will run out of things to say fairly quickly and will not be able to really follow or adhere to the requirements of the paper. Meaning, if you pick 2 poems that really don't have anything to talk about as it relates to their similarities and differences, you're probably not going to get past page 3. And that's going to drop your grade, because when I say 1750 in word count or 7 pages, I really mean that. No more, no less. Don't give me a paper that's 12 pages long, but don't give me a paper that's only 5 pages long either. 7 pages or the word count. That's what you need to do. And if you look, I sort of gave you a generic outline to use and tell you what you need to do as it relates, choice, as it relates to choice A. You can use this for option A as well, right? Piano 1, piano 2. I tell you how many paragraphs you need to have. Basically, 11 paragraphs will yield about 1,750 to 1,760 words, which is basically the word count, which would get you to the 7 pages. Now, you can modify this. You can make it a little longer, a little less as it relates to individual paragraphs. But if you follow this template as it relates to the outline, and you pick 2 poems, if you decide to do option B, or if you do option A, you can still, like I said, you can still apply this outline to option A. You're just going to have to, whatever option you choose, you're really just going to have to squeeze the heck out of both poems. That's how you're going to get your word count. That's how you're going to get your paper length. You want to make sure that you're using quotes from both poems to support what you're trying to get across. Make sure that your paper has a thesis statement, not a question, right? It's a statement. It should end in a period. Whether you're trying to argue or disprove something, you should have a sort of a main arching idea throughout the entire 7 pages that relate to the 2 poems that you choose to write about if you're doing option B, or the 2 piano poems if you're doing option A. Again, this is where I stress, please send drafts. The drafts, if you send as many as humanly possible between now and when this thing is due in about 2 weeks, should, and if you take what what I and Smart Thinking, because I would send it to Smart Thinking too as many times as you can, our comments and suggestions to heart, we're pretty much going to tell you what you need to work on to fix to improve your grade. All those comments and suggestions that I put in the margins, those are there to help you improve the grade. You should start seeing those comments and suggestions disappear with each draft that you send me. Obviously, I'm not going to catch everything in one draft. That's why I say multiple drafts. If it takes 17 drafts to get an A for you, then that's what you need to do. If you don't care about the A so much, if you just want a C or a B, then you probably don't have to send 17 drafts. But and the same thing with Smart Thinking, because Smart Thinking is not going to catch everything in the first read either. So just be mindful of that. You do have time to start drafting this, because today's the 12th. You have all of this week. You have all of next week. And then, bam, the 24th is going to be here. So if you look, basically the 12th to the 19th is 7 days. It's a week. You have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You have about 12 days or so at this point. So keep that in mind. One last thing before I end this, because I have to get to another virtual tutoring session, is the
Phrastic.
Yeah, phrastic poem that you're going to need to do with your literary workshop. So in this way, this is really sort of like it's like that literary workshop 1, where you sort of wrote, about a page of fiction. You don't really have to think too hardly on questions or a discussion post. This is where you can kind of be a little bit more creative on your end, to showcase some of your talents, because everybody has talents. And most folks that, did really well with, that fiction workshop. There was some stuff there, you still have to sort of be formal with it as it relates to grammar and that type stuff. You want to check your spelling. But for the most part, I really enjoyed reading those. So this eclectic poem, I give you some information on what it is here, a little bit more. It goes in a little bit more detail and gives you some examples. But basically what you're going to do, and if you click, I've already put mine up that I did a week or so ago. So if you click here where it says workshop, I did one on basically trick-or-treat, because ever since COVID came into our lives, trick-or-treating has been sort of non-existent in a lot of ways. It wasn't really, we didn't do much with it last year. One, in this particular area was because of the rain, and two, COVID, right? A lot of places were just not doing the trick-or-treating. So what I did was I wrote a poem based on a picture that I found basically using Google Images. You can use any type of picture that you want. You don't really see, because I wasn't able to upload my picture here, but this is the poem I got out of it. It's my particular poem. And what I did was, if you click here, you're going to see the document with the picture on there. Now, yours doesn't need to be necessarily 29 lines long. I would say, again, a good half a page to a page would be suffice. But this is the picture. And you want to include the picture with your poem. And you want to make sure that you're citing it correctly. Here I did a footnote. You can use a footnote. If you need to know how to do a footnote, I can show you how to do that. Otherwise, you just do a regular works cited page. And you're basically going to write a poem based around your particular image that you choose. Obviously, make the image, don't make it appropriate for a sophomore level, college level class. Because, you're going to upload it, other people could see it, that type deal. You don't want to pick something that's going to be, that would, your grandma would be embarrassed by, that type deal. I think I know what, I think you probably know what I'm getting at there. Make it content related to a college level class. But you're free to pick pretty much any picture or image that is suitable, and then write a poem on it. It doesn't necessarily need to rhyme. It doesn't necessarily, because I did more of a less like a free verse type deal. But we looked at other, at this point, we looked at various ways that a poem could be structured or formed, right? We looked at sonnets. If you want to try your hand at a sonnet, try your hand at a sonnet if you want to do that. If you want to do sort of like a ballad, try your hand at a ballad. If you want to do it sort of like a lyrical poem, try your, you don't necessarily have to follow a particular form. It could be free verse. Mine rhymes at certain places and then it doesn't. So just sort of keep that in mind. And that should be really the only problem where you may have trouble would be maybe with the citation. And that's where you can send me your link, or you can send me that particular paper and or that particular image, and I can help you get a citation that will work for you. But you're going to have to start sending me this stuff before Sunday, because there's so much I can do between now and Sunday. So you have an image in mind, and if you want me to help you with a citation, please send me the image, send me the link, and I will, help you get the proper citation. And you want to make sure that you insert the picture, like I did here, into your document. Now, the way it happened with mine, it broke apart my lines. You can put it before if you want. You can put it after. You can sort of put it in the middle, or like it did with me, it sort of broke up my lines. And a lot of it was because of the size. But as long as I see a picture and I can look at your picture and then read your poem and relate the two. I can see the connection. Then it should be good. Just make sure that your spelling is correct, your grammar is correct, that type deal, and it should be really, I hope, an easy 100 for everybody. All right. So I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick. Remember the extra credit. If you go back to lessons, some of y'all did the pre-test. Some of y'all didn't even do any of this yet. You do have until the 2nd of November. Once you do the pre-test, you want to go through the modulars, and it should redirect you to a post-test. If it doesn't, then you're only going to get half of your points. In this case, it's out of 12, so you're only going to get 6 points if you only did the pre-test. If you want the full 12 points, then you need to do the post-test. And I sent out a link because some students were having issues. It wasn't redirecting them. So you want to check your email for, last week or a week before. I give you that link to the post-test. Once I see that you've taken both the pre-test and the post-test, and I verify that with our librarian here, Lorna, then I will apply those 12 points. If you do it before Essay 1 or Essay 2 or Exam 2, then I will, if you want me to, I will put those 12 points to an earlier assignment. Otherwise, I would just put these 12 points either to your poetry essay or your poetry exam, wherever I think you would benefit the most from it, or you can kind of tell me, hey, I want it on the poetry essay or the poetry exam. Now, the other bit of extra credit was that student survey. And I might have to go back to look for that, but I sent that in an email too, so bear with me here. I've got a lot of emails. Okay. So it was back on, I think, the 6th of October, which was a Wednesday, a little after 1 o'clock. You should have received an email that said read. So you read the email, and basically you're going to click on this link. It's going to take you to a survey, a student evaluation survey. Now, you have to do this for all classes, whether they're in person or online. Now, I can't control whether your other instructors will give you extra credit like I am, but they're going to want you to take this regardless. You can't necessarily click on, if you're taking 5 classes, you can't click on each one, 5 instructors here and hit next. You have to do it one at a time. So if you're taking a history class, you're going to have to come back and take it. If you're taking a math class, you're going to have to come back and find the instructor for that. So for me, you're going to find my name basically near the end of that 4th column. You click on that, you hit next, you go through, I think it's like 8 to 10 questions. It doesn't really take you 15 minutes. Make sure that you look at the question, you read it carefully, and you answer it truthfully and honestly. Question 5 is probably the longest. It may take you the most time, but you want to be careful because it starts with strongly disagree, then neutral, then agree, and then strongly agree. So make sure that you're bubbling the correct ones. Obviously, otherwise that's going to cause some problems. And then after that, after you hit submit, you want to take not only a screenshot of this. So this is the other step. You're going to take a screenshot of this page, but you're also going to take a screenshot of, after you hit submit, where does it take you? I know where it's going to take you, and that's how you're going to get your other easy, free 10 extra credit points, which I will apply. If you tell me where you want these 10 points, I will put them there. Otherwise, I'm probably going to put them on a earlier assignment. I think either exam 1 or essay 1 would probably be more beneficial, and that's where I've been putting some of them. Some students have already done this. So as you are doing both of these extra credits, I'm putting them already on your assignments. So you should start seeing your grade improve. Some folks that had high B's have, a strong middle to low A at this point. So it does help. So if you look at that and the extra credit that I actually provided for you with those fill in the blank questions on exam one, right? There was 12 points there. There's 12 points with the library assignment, and there's 10. So basically at this point, 8 weeks in, I've given everybody a chance to possibly earn up to 34 extra credit points, which is really, for a college class, is probably a little bit too much, but I like to give back when I can. I will probably say, though, our last 7 weeks or so, there probably will not be any more extra credit opportunities, except for, when I drop either your lowest quiz grade, your lowest discussion post, or your lowest workshop grade. Because we just don't have time. We're going to get into drama the last 5 weeks of the class. We have weekly assignments that go along with that. We have a research paper that's going to be over the drama unit and the works that we do there. And then we have that Proctor U final exam, which we'll be talking a little bit more about before Thanksgiving break. So be wary of that. All right. So please send me emails, send me drafts. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm here to help. I want to help. But if you don't communicate with me, I really can't read minds. Otherwise, I would, pick the winning lottery numbers and won the lottery already multiple times. I do have certain folks in this particular class that are failing at this point just because they're not turning stuff in. They haven't logged in for weeks. I have some folks that have a 0 because they haven't turned anything in since we started. They log in every week to see the 0, but they don't reach out for help or anything. Of course, by this point, like I said in the syllabus, this is a fast-paced nature course. We don't have time for makeup work. So if you're really failing the course, I can't drop you until you tell me you want to be dropped. Otherwise, if you're doing enrollment, you're going to have to go through your high school coordinator to get that going. If you're not doing enrollment, you can easily go to the college register and ask them to drop you, or you can simply send me an email and say, hey, this is what's going on. I'd rather take this class later when I have more time to focus. I will go ahead and drop you. Otherwise, if, I don't get an email, or you don't go to your high school coordinator, or you don't go and, take the initiative to drop yourself, each week that you don't turn something in, your grade's going to stay at 0. And when we get to the final week, when it's time to submit final grades, then that's the grade I'm going to submit. You're going to have a 0 as your final grade. So please be mindful of that, because Thursday I have to send in midterm grades. So whatever Blackboard shows as your grade by 6 p.m. this Thursday is what I'm going to send to the college. And of course, if it's D or lower, you're probably going to have somebody, either your high school coordinator, somebody in the college, get in contact with you and ask you what's going on. Otherwise, again, please reach out. The earlier the better if you're struggling. I can't do much if I already graded an assignment and you didn't do so well on it. I can do a lot more to your service if you're struggling. Wait, you've been struggling. If you send me emails before you have to take that poetry exam or submit that poetry essay, please reach out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it here. It went a little longer than I wanted to, but that's okay. I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and I will see you hopefully next week when we do another virtual meeting here. Thanks and have a good week.